we want to welcome you to part 5, Unraveling the Mystery of AAC, wrapping things up with funding. So, we're winding down. We've gone from that, who's a good candidate for AAC, to now we've done our trials, we've got all this information, and we want to get it funded. And one of my favorite things is asking you all, why are you here today? So our choices for this round are: A, I have completed the device trials, but not sure what the next steps are. B, I have never written an AAC evaluation report, and if you want to even add there, it scares the bejeebers out of me. We've been there. C, there are so many possible funding sources. How do I know what's needed? D, I want to learn about all the things that are needed for a funding package for a client to purchase an SGD or a speech generating device. Or is it all of the above, or a random other, something we didn't think of?
Oh, we started out a solid B and D, but then we got some all of the aboves. I don't know.
Not since grad school. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's either all of the above and a B or D kind of night.
Wanting to streamline my process, like it. All right. Well, we really feel like this is going to be helpful. Again, we're going to show you and talk about PRC Saltillo way of doing things. However, it's a universal process. You need to find out about your state requirements, and the information that's going to go in there, regardless of where you're going, is going to be in there. So here we go.
Cameras off.
Cameras off. Thank you. I want to make sure the internet doesn't fail us now. So agenda for tonight is, in the next hour and a half, we're going to review how we got here. It's been a long and winding road, right? That journey we're on. Then we're going to talk about putting together the evaluation report. So what does that entail? What needs to go in there? What does it look like, and what shouldn't it look like? We're going to talk about assembling a funding package, what that means and what's in it. Submitting a complete package and what that'll help you achieve. The whole submission process, which again, depending upon what state you're in, what company you're going with, might be slightly different, but for the most part, pretty similar. And then we will briefly touch on approvals, deferrals, and denials, what those are and what they might mean. And those are those possible outcomes from insurance, but definitely utilize your AAC consultant during all this process to make sure that those questions can be answered. And last but not least, we're going to show you some resources online that you can refer back to and help to make this process a little less painful. Your learner outcomes for this session, as well as a reminder about our icons for our handouts. So there's 2 different handouts that were in that AAC Learning Journey repository. The notes handout has the highlights and key points from tonight, as well as spots for you to jot down notes. Tools handout includes forms and documents that we thought might be helpful for you to use later, that you can make copies of, you can share with others. And then the website icon is going to let you know that there's maybe a resource online that we don't want to have, a printed copy, or there's not a PDF copy, and the link will be provided. Okay, so how do we get here? AAC consideration storyline. So an AAC evaluation report, or AAC funding report, however you want to call it, can be looked at as if we're writing a narrative that tells the reader or the funding source about the individual who needs AAC and why this AAC is needed. We're weaving all this information together to tell this story about our student, about our client, about this AAC learner, so that they get a clearer picture of, hey, this is why this device is really needed. When I started thinking about this, and as Courtney and I talked about something visual to help us think about how are we putting this all together, it reminded me of the Hmong story cloths. I worked in St. Paul schools, and we had a lot of families from a Hmong background, and something that's part of their culture and that were hanging in a lot of my schools were these Hmong story cloths. And they tell the history around events and parts of their culture in the Hmong community. And they're just these gorgeous tapestries that have embroidered things on them that represent the people and the places. So it just is really meaningful to me. And that's what I felt like we kind of are doing with this AAC evaluation report. We're trying to weave this together into this amazing story cloth to tell somebody, this is what this needs, or this person needs. Here's their strengths. Here's what we're missing, and why this AAC system is going to be so beneficial to them. This does not need to be a brand new evaluation assessment that you're completing. We've talked about that before, but this report is different than the other kinds of evaluation reports you may be writing in the schools or in inpatient or outpatient therapy. You're going to gather all your information from various places and sources that we've talked about today. And like different threads or pieces of yarn, we're going to use them to create this report. We're going to wrap it all together and make this beautiful masterpiece that is your student or your client's story. So let's get started in writing the story about your AAC user. When we're wrapping things up, you can think of it as taking all that together and creating this narrative, and just this, cute little visual of Granny knitting. I just love that picture. I don't know why. Where are you going to write the report? Some schools and clinics have a report template that you're going to use for this purpose. Totally fine. However, we know that not all of you are going to have something like this to use, or it might not completely meet your needs. PRC Saltillo has an online toolkit at aacfunding.com that you can use to walk through the sections of the report and the documents that you're going to need. You might have a Word document or template that you like to use. Great. That can be uploaded and used as well. Or there are State Department of Human Service website templates or report forms that they recommend or they require that you use. That's fine too. Key thing is that not necessarily where you create it, but what you put into it. So as long as we have all the information we need in the report, how you got there is, irrelevant. Just make sure you have all this information in the report. All right. So for many of you, evaluation reports for AAC might be new. And I think that was evident in our responses as to why we're here, and which is great. We hope then this is going to help walk you through that. AAC evaluation reports for funding don't look like academic reports for, initial evaluation for special education or 3-year evaluation. So this might look different than what you've written in the past. And for some, I've equated it to, it might hurt your SLP heart. If you're a speech pathologist and you're looking at some of what we're going to say tonight and you're going, wait, well, what? It's okay. We are writing for a different purpose for a different reason. We're not trying to qualify somebody for services or state that they meet this disability category. Okay. We're trying to get a picture of medical necessity for a speech generating device. So we need to be looking at the strengths of our client or our student who's using that system and how the system could meet their needs. So we're going to be looking at more the medical model of writing a report versus an educational model where we're sometimes looking at the daily living and educational needs or the academic areas. And so when we're thinking about what this report is going to look like, we're aiming for that medical model of writing it. This might be a mental shift for you. Reach out to your AAC consultant to guide you, ask questions, look it over with you, all of those things as you are first starting out.
All right. And so one of the things that you have to add to your toolbox to help you get started with this evaluation writing process, and especially if it is a new process to you, right? If you're switching from that educational model to that medical model, is this speech evaluation worksheet. Now, I want to make it very clear that this is not your actual evaluation. This is not what gets submitted to us for submission to the insurance or the funding source, but rather this template is really really designed to help you gather the information you need to write your AAC evaluation report. And so within this worksheet, within this template worksheet, you can find all the needed information that you're going to need for the assessment, including the trial. And all of that information can be gathered here so that when you then go to sit down and write your report, you're able to really summarize what happened in your assessment, what happened in your trial, and write the story of your client. And really, it's important to focus on writing the story of that individual because there is not a lot of standardized testing available, as we've said, that really highlights the need or the importance for an AAC system. And oftentimes reviewers at insurance companies, right, might not necessarily be familiar with certain diagnoses or why an AAC system is needed for an individual with X disorder or diagnosis, right? So we need to write the story and really help them see the whole picture, the whole story about why it's needed. So is this me or you, Heather? I think this is you.
Sorry, me. I had a fruit fly go in front of my face at the same time. We're going to bring our case study guy, Max, back to the table. And we can use all the information that we gathered about Max during our assessment, during our feature matching, and during our device trials to pull up and find all the resources that give us all of this information to help us create a funding report for him. In your tools handout, there are 2 completed speech evaluation worksheets with information about Max. One is looking through the lens of, guess what, the accent device was the better fit for him. And one is looking at it from the perspective of, hey, the NovaChat was a better fit for him. These are just samples for you to refer back to so that you can go, oh, what was in that? We talked about these different sections on the worksheet. What went there? What were some of the examples that they said I could maybe be looking for? And as Courtney mentioned, if you start looking at this early on, you can start gathering some of this information, and then you find those spots where maybe you didn't have the information. You're going to need the physician's name. You're going to need to find those ICD-10 codes, those kinds of things that you can just start jotting down early on in the trial or consideration process to get you ready.
Yeah, and so once you have all of that information, you've got your speech evaluation worksheet completed and you're ready to sit down and start writing that evaluation, you come to the first chapter, chapter 1, which is really just sharing background knowledge about your client. And this really helps set the stage at this point in your report about who your client is and really being able to give them that big picture. So, the tips here are that you want to be succinct in your approach to providing background information. You don't need to give them a year by year history of what this client has done and the progress that they've made, because you're going to lose your reviewer, your reader. They're going to start skimming. But you do also want to make sure that that you're providing enough information for that reviewer to see the bigger picture and the need and the again, if we're thinking about it in the medical sort of model, maybe some of what those deficit areas are and why we need this. But keep in mind, just another little helpful tip, the reviewer at the insurance company is probably not another speech pathologist looking at this report and reading it. They're probably somebody in the medical field, but probably not somebody with the same depth and background as an SLP. So limiting your use of jargon and standardized scoring terminology might be something helpful. Instead, you want to paint the picture, use your words, and tell that story. I don't know how many more metaphors we can get in there.
I was impressed. I was going to start tallying. All right. So starting out with basic client information. So we're going to look at each of the sections on that worksheet and what kind of information goes in there and then how it applies to your evaluation report. So that first section, that basic client information, we need emergency contact information or parent guardian, whoever the responsible party is going to be if they're not their own guardian. The SLP who's doing this eval and trial, we're going to need their information as well. Medical and speech diagnoses, that's where saying, hey, you're going to need ICD-10 codes for both a medical and a speech diagnosis. You can Google ICD-10 codes, as well as one of the resources we talk about is that AAC toolkit on our funding website. And in there, you can actually type in what diagnoses and it'll pop in what the ICD-10 code is. So that's kind of slick. Next part is that background information. You want to provide the brief narrative. Like Courtney said, we don't need to go year by year. We want to highlight pertinent medical information, as well as a general overview of their speech and language skills and intelligibility, and maybe a short history of what they've received when they started, that sort of thing. Discuss their current mode of communication and why it's not meeting their needs, but keep it brief. Again, there's going to be other sections where we go into more depth. So this is just that big picture. If they do already have a speech generating device or an SGD, you need to reference that system here, when it was purchased and why it's no longer meeting their needs. One tip and trick, as we're going to have lots of tips for you going through this. Just saying it's 5 years old, they need a new one, isn't going to cut it. We all know that means, hey, this device is starting to act up or isn't working the way it used to work, maybe not holding a charge. You do have to be specific. And if we don't have any of those reasons, we're just saying the device is 5 years old and we want a new one, some insurance will say, sorry, you didn't give us any reason as to why that system isn't meeting their needs anymore. So provide some of that data. If it's only holding a charge and I got to sit by an outlet, if it's no longer repairable, the company no longer makes that one, it's been retired, any of that. Or maybe we have a change in access. Keep it short and to the point. I mentioned there's other sections in your report where you're going to go into some more details for some things. And that's where it's good to have another pair of eyes too, to just let you know, hey, maybe we can move this to a different section. More of this information can be obtained from those previous eval reports, from interviews, and all those assessment tools that you used previously.
Yeah, and so if you're using our AAC funding toolkit, there will be specifically a section that really prompts you to look even more in depth and describe more in depth their current speech and language abilities and how you have determined those current abilities. And things that you could put in here, did you use standardized testing, informal assessments, any observations, interviews, family interviews, things like that. You want to make sure that you include any and all of those things that you've done to determine their speech and language abilities. You then also will need to note, some of the information about their impairment. And so you can see that next box is sort of this anticipated course of impairment. And some of the things you want to talk about here is this, chronic condition or an acute impairment? What's the current course? Has it been stable? Is it progressing? Is it deteriorating? In the future, do you anticipate any deterioration or things like that? Or do you expect it to remain stable or decline over time? This is the part where it differs a little bit from some of those other models. It can feel a little bleak and weary, but it's really important here that we really describe what that current level of functioning is, so that later on we can get to the happy, optimistic stuff where we can show, but if they had this, here's what we could achieve. So it's just really important to be realistic and describe the individual's level of performance and or impairment in this section.
All right, we are already in chapter 2 of our story. Here's where we want to give more information about their current ability levels. So we started to hint at those speech levels, right? And this is where we're going to cover a variety of areas, not just the speech and language. And you want to be adding in the details that continue to help paint this clear picture of who this person is. So for instance, we got a little Max here on the screen. Who is Max? So we are going to start. Oh, sorry, Courtney.
Nope, go ahead.
Starting out, let's look at access. So you want to provide brief information about fine motor access. How are they able to access that device? You had tools, you had assessments. Here's where you get to use that and let them know this is what they need. So just a reminder. And sometimes, it can be a drop-down menu that's listing these out, or you're just going to remember, I need to jot down one of these access methods. You can gather info from OT evals and observations if they are getting OT. Use that from your feature matching, but you don't have to completely copy and paste an OT eval summary. Okay, you get that basic information. How is their fine motor going to impact their use of a device? So you can use different terminology. It could be touch access, input instead of direct selection, but how are they accessing that device? And then what are those skills that you're saying dictate why he needs a key guard, why they're going to need head tracking, why they might need switch scanning. And so extrapolate that information from the OT eval if they have that, or your observations, but you don't have to copy and paste a whole section.
Do you just want to keep going with fine motor since you're already...
Sounds good. The focus of this section then is around their ability to use the SGD, or that speech device. Can they isolate a finger? Can they select buttons without a key guard? Do they need a key guard to help with that consistency and that modality? So depending upon your learner, this section might be really short. It might be they can access it without any supports. No modifications or accommodations are needed. Bam, that's all you need. So again, keep it short, keep it sweet, but paint the picture of what are their strengths and their needs when it comes to fine motor.
And you can start to paint the picture in that section, if you can start to write those details and give that character all those layers, right? For later on down the line, like if you do select a key guard or a touch guide, right? That's where you lay that foundation and build that in. Mobility. So I'll jump in here. So this is also a fairly short and simple section. In this mobility section, we're really here talking about the gross motor skills of our client. Are they ambulatory? Are they using an assistive device like a walker or crutches or quad cane or whatnot? Or maybe it's a wheelchair, but we're just really describing what their mobility status is here. Again, it starts to help paint that picture or write those details and those layers into that character about when we say we need a mount, this is why, because we've identified that mobility is that issue. It is a factor impacting those selections. So keep it short, keep it simple. You don't really need to get input from the PT or OT, but it doesn't hurt necessarily if you want to just double check that you're saying something right, or if you're referencing something right. But chances are you probably know what their mobility status is, and you can describe that pretty accurately.
I was going to say, usually the key piece, if they are a wheelchair user or a gait trainer, those kinds of things, is finding the model of that chair for mounting. Yeah. And so that's often where I was like, hey, favorite PT, help me figure out what chair this is.
Yeah, but you don't necessarily need to include that information in the eval at this point. That information
correct
later. Yeah.
Correct.
Yep.
All right. Next, you're looking at hearing and vision. Again, this is relating to the use of the device. Do they have glasses or hearing aids? Do we need to modify anything on the device to aid in their vision or their hearing so that they can be successful when they access this device? You would want to talk about, the glasses, and even if it's, yes, they have glasses, but they never wear them or they're always breaking them. Make note of it. And then we can talk about, so because they didn't have their glasses, we made sure that they had bigger buttons or had this visual effect so that they knew what they were accessing. Those kinds of things is where you would then talk about, these are settings we used to make them more successful with their system. Same thing with hearing. If it's not impacting, or if you've got hey, We have no formal assessment of their hearing or their vision, but it appears to be within normal limits, or it's not impacting their use of this device, then you're just going to write that. You're just going to state appears to be within normal limits and did not impact their ability to use this speech generating device. I do see a question. Working in public school system, are we supposed to get assigned permission to test, or is this more like a private eval to get the device? Good question. Check definitely with your district teams. Typically, because we're not doing a real evaluation per se, you're assessing dynamically throughout the time. You don't normally need it, but I have had instances where we were doing more of an evaluation. We needed more information before we could even get to a trial. And then we did do, we kind of even just moved up their 3-year reevaluation and did the full get permission to test. But obviously you want to be talking to the family and getting permission to move forward with any of this.
Yeah, you're definitely going to need them on board, because if you're going to submit to insurance, eventually you're going to need that information from them and that permission. So
yeah. So, but I would start with just asking your district people, what the practices are there.
And so in this section, Heather had just talked about really using in that other section, there's just some drop downs for hearing and vision, where you can identify what level of functioning they are in. And here's where you get to be a little bit more descriptive about their hearing and vision abilities. And this would sometimes be the section where, sometimes we get tempted to maybe be more brief than we should be. But, if there are glasses, you want to make sure that, because you've identified vision impairment, you want to say that, yes, they, wear glasses and they are corrected to, whatever, or that they consistently wear their glasses and it doesn't seem to be an issue here. So this is your opportunity to say, like, yeah, this hearing impairment exists, but they always wear their hearing aids and they're able to, function pretty well within their environment with their hearing aids. So again, keeping it brief, not completely skipping over by just saying, hearing is within normal limits or something like that.
Yeah. Give some information so that they know you've looked at it and considered how it impacts.
Yep.
This next section is going to be a little more detailed, since speech and language skills are the main reason we're often looking at getting them a device, correct? We want to review our formal and informal evaluations that have been done over the years and make a narrative overview of their strengths and weaknesses, so that we're starting to add that next layer of information. Share examples of how they're able to understand directions. Share examples of supports that are being used to help aid in their comprehension. Maybe they have a visual schedule or visual supports. What tools might they use to help with any of that understanding? You can summarize that here in the receptive language section. Don't worry about those standardized scores. Often, as we said earlier, the reviewer is not familiar with what those mean. And so putting a standard score of 55 in there isn't going to mean much, but the description of what that looks like for this individual, that they have a standard score of this. If you want to list it, but then give that description of what that really looks like. We want to focus on the details that show their comprehension, what they're able to understand, and how that might impact their use of a speech generating device. Any other thoughts for the receptive section, Courtney?
No, I agree. It's just to piggyback on what you said about standardized scores, and we've said it earlier, right? Like, there's a lot of back and forth about are individuals who use AAC devices even represented in those normative samples? So can we even consider them standardized scores because they're not in the norm sample? True. But it's a fact of life, right? That to get a device funded, we have to have a standardized test score. So, I always encourage teams, you put it in there, but then, like Heather said, because that reviewer is not really going to know what that 55 means or that below 50 means, you give them those details to help them build up that character and really understand what's happening and what that looks like for them on a daily basis.
Right. And that's where I was alluding to earlier. Like this might hurt your speech pathologist heart, like not putting scores or not having some of that. But we want to make sure that who's ever reviewing this understands without a shadow of a doubt what this person is able to understand, and not get bogged down in the weeds. And so this might be one of your longer sections, but it's definitely not going to be as long as what your typical speech and language evaluation receptive language portion is going to look like, would be my guess, is that we're going to scale it down and really make those key points around their understanding and their cognitive or comprehension of things.
Yeah. And this was sometimes the section, and even in this expressive language section, so you don't have to go back, but this
Okay.
was sometimes the section when I was writing my evaluation, like if my AAC evaluation was falling between my regularly scheduled evaluations,
Mhm.
like I could pull some of that information from those other assessments. And I know we've said it before, but that's where I can get some of that information. I'm not going back to completely retest, I'm pulling that. So same thing with expressive language. If I've given an expressive vocabulary test and I've given an expressive language test earlier in the year, I can pull that information into this evaluation and really use it to help describe my client. So within this section, the expressive language, and I want you guys to take note that it's expressive language and speech. So there's not if you're using AAC funding, there's not a separate section where you specifically talk about speech and as it relates to articulation, and that thinking about it in that SLP brain. So in this expressive language section, you want to make sure that you're including both. This is your opportunity to talk about that. So you want to provide information about their current mode of communication and how it is meeting or not meeting their needs, right? Is more realistic. And this is the section where you can list out that information. So if we're thinking about Max, is he highly unintelligible? And we can put those numbers. He's 50% unintelligible to familiar listeners, and 25, that drops to 25 for with unfamiliar listeners. You can discuss what are those communicative functions that they're currently having to communicate and why their current method of communication is not meeting those needs. Then you could also add in, as I mentioned, those speech skills. So you could, if you did some articulation testing or anything else, speech intelligibility, if you had more defined rankings, you could repeat that again here. Even if you did oral motor exams, you can discuss that in this section as well. This is also the section, and it's worth repeating. You might sound like a broken record even within your evaluation. I know Heather and I have been saying we sound like broken records, but if you're telling this story, you're going to repeat yourself more than once with details. In this expressive language section, there is an opportunity, because you are describing how they currently are communicating. There's an opportunity to talk about, have you used any non-tech or light tech systems, right? You'll list that information out again later in the evaluation report, but it's another opportunity to layer that in and describe what that looks like and why it's not meeting the needs. So there's a lot of things that can go into this expressive language and speech section, but you just want to make sure that you're giving that detail, you're providing that information, and really helping people understand the need.
And then this is what it looks like on that worksheet, filling in. And if you're using the toolkit, there's some spots where there's drop downs or spots where you can click box, and that's on your worksheet. And it didn't come through as visually on here for you, but you'll get the idea that they understand significantly more than what they communicate, more or about the same. So you can give that overview, and then a spot for you to list out some more information about their receptive skills, their expressive skills, and their speech skills. And as Courtney mentioned, that's often clumped together, expressive and speech. I did see a question pop up, and there's a great resource, Jen. The question was, we do all this work in a school setting. We have, provide all of this, we write it. If insurance doesn't approve it, maybe we do the appeal and we still get a denial. Is this something then that the school district is responsible for? Potentially, yes. However, looking at all the sources and the funding ahead of time, we can usually avoid that, double denial by starting early on, making sure that it's a network. You've dotted your I's and crossed your T's, but just know that that is a possibility. And some districts then may provide like an iPad as a kind of a stopgap or look into those other funding sources. But there is an online recorded webinar presentation, whatever you want to call it, by Lou Gollenker that talks about that portion of things, because that's often where administration is like, nope, you guys aren't even going to look at this because we're going to have to pay for it. So goes through a lot of myths around the funding and what the responsibilities are for our public school settings.
Yeah, and I was going to bring that webinar up from Lou, because Lou would say that no, even he would say all schools can write these evaluations and they would not be on the hook if the insurance denies because of all these other things. So I would definitely look that up. And he talks about that in that webinar.
And there are districts, yeah, that just choose to provide devices. And that's kind of a state by state, and that's where discussing these things with your regional consultants, because they do have that kind of geographical, observations going on in your state of what they're seeing and what's trending.
And Judith, to your question about are there completed sample assessment reports for specific disabilities, there are on AAC funding. There are some sample reports that you can pull up on.
We'll show those, yeah, where those tabs are. If we forget, remind us. And yes, we'll look up Lou's webinar information before we go. All right. Next section is still labeled on our toolkit, language skills and abilities, and then it's the literacy portion of things. So we want to start looking at, what educational level. So what grade are they currently in, or if they're not in a grade, what is their educational level? Where did they, did they age out? Did they graduate? Those kinds of things. We want to look at just a functional reading level. Has it been assessed formally or informally? And what are some just key pieces of their literacy skills? Are they, starting to identify letters? Are they starting to sound out words or have some sight words? It doesn't have to be anything big again. So if you haven't assessed, maybe we're not able to assess their literacy skills yet. That's okay. We just want to give that observation then. And in this section, marking off about where we think, get that information from their teachers, things you've observed. Maybe there has been some assessment, maybe there hasn't. Do what you have. And we want to talk about how this, is going to work with the device as well. So if they have that emerging literacy, we can be working on sight words with a lot of our core words, and we can talk about that if that's going to be a key thing. Or if they are literate and they benefit from more spelling based, we want that information too.
Yeah, so now looking to cognitive abilities. And this section within the report is typically just sort of like a checkbox kind of thing, but it's still very important to really look at all of these skills and abilities and make sure that we're checking those things that are representative of our client. One of the nice things, and I think we'll talk about it later, is within our funding website, you can share an eval. And this was always the section where SLPs asked me to review their evals, and they sort of skimmed over this stuff, or maybe they only checked one or two of these things. But these cognitive abilities are really, they are important because they demonstrate the ability for your individual to learn and understand information. So you'll see things like in this section, can they learn new tasks? Sometimes when we look at that, we might think it means something else, but really it's just saying like, can they learn to turn on the device? Can they learn to push this button? Can they, is that an ability? And you want to be honest and say, check that yes box, because for most kids that's true. It is true. That's why we're getting them the device, because
I was
we
going to say.
have faith that they're going to be able to learn to do that. Attending to the display, again, this might be one where, when we were talking about what progress looks like, if you started out with 0 attention and now you're getting attention half of the time when you're modeling, that's attending to the display. And there's going to be a box just with all of these things where you can further describe that. So I think what I'm trying to highlight here is, a lot of these things your clients are demonstrating some level of ability. So just because it's not 100%, you don't want to say, nope, they can't do that. You really want to write that story, give them those details. So can they maintain attention to a task? Maybe it's with a certain level of prompting. Do they remember the locations of symbols? This one, as we get further into the list, these are things they may or may not be doing. Maybe they're not independently remembering those symbol locations. Maybe they're not navigating quite with minimal prompting. Maybe it's more moderate, but or maybe they're independently doing that. Can they independently locate the symbols on a page? Recognizing that the SGD can be used to communicate. And that was something we've been talking about a lot today, right? That with that aha moment, but maybe also just any other information about their learning and their abilities. So if we go to the next, you'll see that these are just those little check boxes, and then you really get that opportunity to, again, be brief, be succinct, but also don't just say, they have cognitive skills to use an SGD. We want to describe and create this story for our reviewer.
And if you have standardized scores, great. But again,
Yes.
You said that earlier. And that doesn't always mean anything, even to us. If I think you remember me saying, I used to have teams say, oh, but this individual only has a 50 point IQ. Your point. How do we know they're learning, and how can they use this device and show us that they can learn with it? And it might not be based on their population, correct?
Correct.
All right, chapter 3 of our story. Here's where we're going to share more about their communication needs. So we're talking about their skills, their strengths, some of their deficits in chapter 2. Now we're going to start sharing what we know about their communication needs.
Oh, sorry, Heather. Can you keep going? I am tracking down Lou's YouTube website.
Perfect. Yep. No, you're good. And mine, it was one of those like where your PowerPoint's like just a second and then you can proceed. So on here, what we are going to start looking at is what will they need to communicate? What are we hoping they're going to be able to communicate? Where are they going to be communicating? So if this sounds familiar with that set process, this is where you can stick that information into your report. We also want to be talking about who are they communicating with, and when do they need to be able to communicate this? So really talking about all those possibilities that are out there. And what this might look like on our toolkit are checkboxes. Who are the possible communication partners? Check, 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 check. If they aren't going out in the community and we're not communicating with them, okay, that's fine. I always say, even when we're little, if we can identify that they are going to be communicating health-related information, medical-related information, remember, this is medical necessity, we can start doing aided language to model for them at the appointments. Like, oh, your tummy hurt at home. We can tell the doctor or tell the nurse, our tummy hurts, and show them where that is so that they realize this is another setting where that device could be used. So pick all the ones that apply to your particular individual. Same thing for the possible environments. Check off any of that and all that apply for your individual. Possible reasons to communicate. These are just a small possibility. If you have more options, There's spots for you to add things in and those possible situations. So is it one-on-one in small groups, family social gatherings, large group events, telephone interactions? All those can be things that we want to write about.
And because insurances are always going to want to know that you have considered the least costly option for them for AAC, there is a section to talk about. Again, remember we said you're probably you could highlight this in your expressive language section. There's going to be a section in this report that details and discusses the non-speaking AAC systems that you have looked at or considered and or trialed. And you want to make sure that you're sharing why those have been ruled out as the primary form of communication for that student. And there's lots of reasons. We know that they limit the functions of communication. They can limit the environment in which we communicate. They can even limit our communication partners. And so we want to make sure we're really highlighting all of that information and sharing it. And so then once you have gone through and checked that box that like, yes, I have actually in fact considered this, you then get the opportunity to really talk about what those approaches were. And as we said, why they're not viable as a long-term solution for your client. And then just as a quick overview, you are going to describe, the prognosis for developing functional speech. Again, they just want to make sure that, that they're not going to get their speech back in, next week and they've paid for this system. Not that that's likely, but that is sometimes one of those drop down boxes that you have to do and you have to justify. Same thing for why speech therapy, more just therapy is not a viable option. You need to discuss that and put that in the report.
All right. And I get to introduce chapter 4. During our assessment time, we completed that feature matching worksheet. And this helped to guide your decision in which devices and apps you were going to trial. So the next portion of the evaluation report is going to discuss and list out the features that you found to be necessary for your student or your client. And I love when you're able to take something we used earlier and apply it here. Look familiar? We were gathering all this on that feature match. And so now we can come through and on our toolkit and on the worksheet here, you can just check off. This is the size device. Here's the hardware features. The other nice thing is, even if we talked earlier, if you're not familiar with some of the features and you read this and you're like, oh, wait, I didn't even think about that. You can be like, yeah, that is totally going to be something that they need. Which I find really helpful. So you don't have to keep it all in the back of your mind. But it goes into voice options that are needed. Is digitized versus synthesized? Would it be helpful for recorded messages, not just the synthesized? Access comes up again here. For some, especially when we're looking at scanning, switch scanning, head tracking or eye tracking. Do they have a combination? Some, maybe I've had individuals where part of the day, their stamina, their motor skills are stronger and they could do a key guard and touch access. But by the end of the day, they were very fatigued and didn't have the best range of motion to do that. And they needed access to head tracking or eye tracking. So in that case, we need to describe why we'd be doing it in that motor aspect of things. But also here we'd be saying, hey, it's a combination. And there's just a note that if it's being funded through Medicare, then they don't typically cover that kind of an option. And then here's some more features that we would be considering and marking off. Excuse me.
All right, so chapter 5 is where we get to what we are the results of that feature matching. and what devices that resulted in trialing. So here you're going to list out all those options. Now, in reality, most funding sources require two, I think the standard is three. You have to consider at least 3 devices. And it's recommended that, and honestly, just best practice, right? That they're not all the same system, right? Like you wouldn't want to say, we tried a NovaChat 5, 8, and 10. We want to be showing for best practice that we considered all of the things. We considered the different language organization methods. We considered the different devices and hardwares and that kind of thing, so that we can really document and show that our decision was, we did our due diligence and we really tried to find the best possible solution for the individual. And based on all of that data and those things that we did, we were able to find the system that at this time best meets their needs. Okay, so you're going to be ruling out 2 of those systems, and then really focusing in on that one system. And you will be required to describe, why system A and C didn't work, but why system B was the star and why it really did work. And that will come in the next sections.
And one thing I always like to remind you guys too is that this is where reaching out to those consultants, the vendors, and getting more information about what's going on in your particular state or particular funding source is that you'll be able to say, I considered this without trialing, and here's why. I have this knowledge about this system, the language organization I knew wasn't going to meet their needs based on the feature matching or the size of the device. This company didn't offer that size, those kinds of things. But some are going to say you have to hands-on trial X amount of devices before you can do this report. So knowing that before you start writing the report, that sometimes you might need to be doing multiple trials, and some you might be able to rule out without trialing, or rule in as a second option. Like maybe we did have those 2 devices that worked well, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna cough. You're good.
Things that we always that you are prompted and we have alluded to in the past slides is, have you considered an iPad with an app? Again, a lot of insurances are looking to figure out, can we use this cheaper solution? And so you should document this in your evaluation report. And the good thing is we've already done all of that work when we were looking at our feature matching and using those frameworks, that we already put the work into this. So this is really where we're just giving the reasons why. The volume wasn't loud enough. It wasn't a dedicated system and couldn't cognitively handle switching between our app and our language system, or behaviorally handle switching between an app, a game, and our language app, or all those other reasons that we've talked about: warranty, durability, accommodations for physical access, maybe even it's the language system. So this last bullet here that you could check, if you're recommending a Unity language system, you can't get that on an app, so you can't get that on an iPad. And then you can see that you will list out the 2 systems, so SGD1 and SGD2, that you considered but were ruled out. And then you're going to give a narrative about why those things were considered and ruled out. And again, be succinct, but give enough detail to really build that character and help the reviewer understand the story.
And this can include where you said, yes, I considered an iPad with a communication app. One of your SGDs that you ruled out can be iPad with touch chat or Proloqua or TDC, whatever it is that you considered on an iPad. And that can be SGD number 1. And you can write up about those reasons why the iPad wasn't a good fit, as well as then talk about why the app itself wasn't a good fit. And then chapter 6, we're going to justify. my favorite slide. You're into that portion of the report where we're telling this funding source why the STAR device meets their needs best and why they should approve the purchase of this device. The key word here, as you see, is justify. We have to justify. We have to use our data. We have to talk about what showed us in that data to make this recommendation. We'll get the reasons why it met their needs the best from your trial data. You should be able to share examples of device use. If you have a table that you want to add in here, great, that shows the examples. If you want to pull examples off your data sheets, perfect. I love when we're able to share those kinds of things because that is concrete. That's something that your reviewer can totally grasp onto and see examples, especially if you're going to show progression. Like, hey, this was always responsive and with multiple prompts. And now look, by week 4, we faded some of the prompts and they were starting to initiate. Those kinds of things you can really display in your trial data. We want to take anything from there and also put it into that narrative form, because there's going to be instances like those communicative functions that they might not totally grasp as a reviewer. So let's write more of a narrative about that before all they were communicating for was, fussing that they didn't like or requesting things, requesting foods. And now look, they were commenting on the hot air balloon they saw outside or something like that. Whatever you were tracking for your data, whatever you were targeting in your trial, whatever that baseline information was and where we were at the end, this is where you want to write it. This is where you want to be a little more detailed, give a little more information, share a lot. If there were added accessories like the key guard or a touch guide, switches, those kinds of things, list them out, as well as why it's recommended that is needed as well. And this is where you do want to talk to your consultants, because some of the things that are add-ons like symbol sets or voice packages, those synthesizers, those can be considered accessories to a lot of funding sources, and you do need to then justify why we're adding that on. And here is what it would look like on the worksheet for you. So it's going to be similar. What language system? So this is where you could talk about it. Use Unity 60 sequenced, word power 60 basic. What accessories, what mount, how long was your trial period, and give some details.
And I will just add, that was always the big stumbling block I found in my territory was, we got all the way to the end and we were recommending accessories like on some of the other paperwork we're going to talk about, but we forgot to include them here. So you really need to include each and every little accessory and piece in that section. So now we're on to chapter 7, which is goal planning. So this is where we get back into the happy mode, right? And we can start being more optimistic and thinking about it. And we can also be happy because we're getting towards the end of this evaluation report. But this is really the section where we want to stop and take a minute and think about what are the goals that we're going to target, immediately. What are those short-term goals if this device is approved? When it arrives, what are we going to do and what are we going to start focusing on short-term? But we also really want to focus on some of those long-term goals as well, so that we can, again, just are documenting that the need for this device is long-term and that we have a plan for this system to be used a long time from now. And so you want to choose, 3 to 5 functional goals that do apply to your client, but I would stress that it should be a combination of short and long-term goals. And that, so I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, that they should be short and long-term goals. Heather, do you have anything to add here?
I just like the third bullet point here, that they're meant to be general for the purpose of funding. If they overlap into your actual IEP goals, your progress goals, whatever you're needing to write for your own intervention and therapy, awesome. like don't have to do double duty, right? But if you don't have goals written specifically around this kind of information, we'll show you some possible options. That's okay too. And so I always let you know, like there is not the goal writing police coming after you after this device is funded to make sure you address these. But I look at it as more, this is keeping in mind, like, okay, what are we going to be addressing once this device gets here? And we want to let the insurance or the funding source know that it isn't just give us the device and away they go. There is a plan in place for how it's going to be used and introduced.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is what it looks like, where you pick those goals. And as Heather was saying, if you wanted to include some of those, you don't have to rewrite the wheel and put in all of your goals, but if you wanted to add some of those other overlapping goals in that other box, you are welcome to do that. But otherwise, you can just pick a few of those functional goals, short and long term, make it a mix. And then in this final section, we do just, you have to have the support of family, so parents and immediate family and anybody else who falls in that team, so that we know that the device is going to be successful. Did we want to talk about the number of recommended sessions?
I usually just give this as a ballpark it. But again, nobody's coming back to say you didn't provide this many. But if you are seeing them twice a week, think about that first month or so that you're seeing them. How many sessions are you going to devote to addressing some of these goals? How many sessions are you going to be using the device? If it's all, every session over those couple months, then jot down 8 sessions. If you're just like, what, we're going to work with the family and the student or client once a month, jot down, we're going to see them a couple times, whatever it is. There's not a right or wrong answer. Don't overthink it. Just, but again, for your planning purposes, how much time are you going to spend on training and getting this up and running right after it arrives?
Yeah, I think I was overthinking it because I've seen a combination of things. I've
Right?
done what you have talked about, where I've said, okay, I've got 6 months and I see him twice a week. And so I see him, this is how many sessions I have. And I think this is probably where you could also check with your local consultant, because I've also seen, like, especially in my territory, some people always put 99 because that was like the lifetime.
Oh,
I know and that translated to some other things. So,
wow.
I would think you just kind of check with your consultant about there, but
Totally.
yeah, don't overthink it. I don't think if you put a number in there, they're going to be like, nope, you didn't put enough sessions down.
Right. Or they're not coming back and show me how many sessions you've seen them.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. Again, it shows that you've got forethought in thinking through how this is going to look.
Yep.
Which brings us to the conclusion of our story, the final chapter of our AAC evaluation report. Getting a little teary-eyed here. All these pieces are coming together. So the final piece of the report is making sure that you've specifically written out what device you're recommending, what model. Is it dedicated, which is what insurance will typically cover? What accessories or add-ons are needed? Those all need to be then written out. I'm recommending that Max receive, or that we purchase this device, a NovaChat 10 dedicated plus model with the acapella voice, key guard, all the things, right? All of that needs to be here. This is something we see get kicked back to teams a lot because it's missing those details. The other piece, you need to sign with your ASHA credentials. So it does have to have an ASHA certified SLP signing if you're a CF, or I will admit I didn't have my C's right away. So I had to have somebody co-signing, going through this process, checking to make sure I had everything on there and signing with me with their ASHA information. But that needs to be in your signature. So if you're doing an electronic signature or a physical signature, write in MS, CCC, SLP, or whatever your degree is on there. That's another one that gets kicked back because we don't have the credentials in there. We don't want to add extra steps to you, right? We already know this timeline is going on and on. So if you can take care of that right away, you won't get it hopefully won't give it bounced back to you. I can't say never. Here's your key takeaways for that evaluation report with that worksheet. You're going to use this to help write your evaluation report. We want to write it like a story to give a clear picture of our client and their needs for AAC. Gathering information from all those sources onto your worksheet will help you write a complete AAC eval report. Give you a second to finish writing those. We'll start talking about putting that whole funding package together.
Yes, the best part when you can hand it off and be done. No, just kidding. This is the fun part. This is where you say, okay, give me my device, and then the fun really begins. So now that you've written up your evaluation report, there are a few more pieces of information you need to gather to make your funding packet complete. Now, we're going to go over just these documents really at a high level because there's a lot of, state-specific documents. I know in my territory, there were at least, there were 2 documents that actually had to be like on the letterhead from the State Department of Health and Human Services. So, this is going to be a really high overview, and we recommend for any of the state-specific things you reach out to your local consultant. But there's going to be some state documents, and then there will also just be some general funding packet source documents that we're going to need. The good thing to know, though, is that there is a checklist available for everybody. And you can find these checklists on the website, and there will give you some information about specific things, both for state specific documents and just a general overview of the documents. But you can see here that the main components, we'll go ahead and go to our checklist.
Clicking on the wrong spot.
The main components of our checklist are going to be the evaluation report, the device selection sheet, the key guard or touch guide selection sheet, which is kind of, so that's your device selection sheet, the key guard or touch guide selection sheet, which is part of that device selection sheet. If you don't need a key guard or touch guide, skip pages 2 and 3, just submit page 1. And if you need a mount, you're going to be completing the mounting selection sheet. And this is where we mentioned earlier, if you were putting in that there is a wheelchair, this is where you're going to be going to your PTs asking for the specific model and make of the wheelchair so that you can get the correct tubing and whatnot. Now, if you don't need a mount, you're going to ignore that and you're going to keep moving right along. And please know that your consultant is always available to help you. And we even have some mounting specialists within the company that are able to really help you pinpoint which mounting pieces and things that are going to be needed and really help you fill out this selection sheet. Okay. The other main components that you need will be the certificate of medical necessity and or the prescription. So there is this sheet that functions as the prescription and that certificate of medical necessity. It's available from the AAC funding website. The important things here are that the SLP fills out sections 1, 2, and 3. Okay, you want to put all of that information. I always told teams the more information you can fill out, the better. So sometimes that included in section 4, like I would put the address and the Medicaid provider number and the doctor's NPI, and literally all they had to do was like sign this thing and date it and send it back to me. But at a minimum, you as the SLP are going to fill out sections 1, 2, and 3. And that's because a lot of the information comes directly from your report or that speech worksheet that you've already filled out. So clinical information, you're going to pull the diagnosis and those ICD-9 or 10 codes. We're in 10 now. Yeah. Section 3, you're going to pull all of those device pieces and accessories. And you also need to list, you might also need to list I call them HICS picks, or some people call them those HCPCS codes. But those are going to need to be included with each of the pieces of equipment that you're recommending.
And I will say that a piece of advice that I give my teams has been whatever you checked off on those device selection sheets. I'm going to try not to make anybody dizzy, but I'm just going to come back to this device selection sheet. Anything I checked off, Accent 1000, dedicated model with Unity, I want acapella. If I checked off those things on my device selection sheet, I should be writing those out here.
Yeah, great.
Especially those add-ons. So it's like a nice check and balance, as well as, did I list those in my evaluation reports? We need to see them across all three pieces.
Yeah, great tip there. Moving along, the other main pieces that you'll need are the client information sheet. So this just gives us that basic information about where to send that device, any insurance information, contact information, diagnosis. And then page 2, do we have page 2? Oh, there is a page 2 to the client information sheet. If you're doing the AAC funding website, though, you might not even see that. It would all be filled out automatically when you're submitting your evaluation. The assignment of benefits. Now, this is a form we do have to have from everybody, and it has to be signed by the responsible party or whoever the insurance policy holder is. This assignment of benefits is what allows us as a company to submit to and charge the insurance company. So this is an important one. This is one of the ones that, if you know the trial is successful and you're at this evaluating process, start trying to get this filled out now by the family so that you have it when you have completed your evaluation and you're able to submit that, because this is one of those pieces that would hold up a submission, if we don't have all of that information.
And one of those tips where she said the policyholder. So if they only have Medicaid or Medicare, and especially if it's a child, it can be any of the either parent signing. Because nobody's holding the policy, the individual has the policy. But if they have a combination or they only have private insurance, which parent carries that insurance? They're the ones who have to sign. So if I have UHC and Medicaid, which parent got UHC, maybe through their work? And that would be the one that has to sign and give their policyholder information.
Yep. And then insurance cards. We needed copies of the insurance cards, both front and back of the card, because we will need to get those numbers in order to make contact with the insurance company and get the necessary information that we have. So we do need that front and back. So the additional pieces, as I mentioned, sometimes there are additional state-specific documents. This one is out of, where is this from, Heather? Alabama. Awesome.
Top of the list alphabetically.
So this one is just an additional piece that's a prescription. It looks like looks like something similar that I was describing, where in my territory you needed a form that was basically just on the state letterhead. This looks very similar to that, but know that all of those documents are on the AAC funding website. And your consultants would also have that information too. For Medicare and other specific documents and Medicaid specific documents, again, depending on the insurance and the funding source, there might be a few additional things that you need to get done. So some of those things that are pretty standard are, most of insurance sources are going to require a face-to-face office visit within the last 6 months. Now that's 6 months at the time that we submit. So one of the things that I always told my families was like, okay, so this is October. We're going to submit by the end of this month, but that means I'm going to submit to PRC. So let's say they're not going to submit till November, but your office visit was way back in April. Well, your visit's going to be overdue. So it's just one of those things where, we want to make sure that we're allowing for all of these buffer times. So I always told my families, if it's been 4 or 5 months, you probably want to make another appointment, and just so that we don't have to go through that step again. But so a face-to-face visit is pretty standard across insurances. Many accepted telehealth during COVID and still are continuing to do those kinds of things. Progress notes might be a requirement, but a lot of times that's something that our funding team can work with to get from the doctor. So the key takeaways there are listed on that screen for you. There is that there's lots of different moving pieces, but make sure everybody kind of knows what documents they're responsible for, and helpful. It's also helpful to set a timeline to make sure everybody gets their part done.
Definitely. All right, just a few more sections before we wrap up for the evening. So we've gathered all this. Now what? We need to submit it. We don't want to just hold on to this, right? So look at what each vendor is requiring or how they expect you to get this information. So a lot of them have fax information. There might be a secure HIPAA compliant upload link on their funding websites. Or if you were using our AAC toolkit on the funding website, you're able to complete your report on there, and then you can upload these extra documents that we were just talking about right there within your login. So just knowing those different options and how you're approaching gathering the documents, if you're filling out the PDF or if you're completing it on the website. And what if something's missing? After you've submitted all of this, that happens. Sometimes the fax didn't work, or we missed a piece, or we're waiting on a piece. A lot of times it's that certificate of medical necessity prescription, getting it signed by the doctor. Get everything else turned in. Send it to the doctor. Let us know you've attempted to get it from the doctor. We can try to reach out. Family can be reaching out. That's typically the best, is when the family is nudging them like, hey, we need that form. But otherwise, get everything together. It is much better to try to get it all together and submit it at once versus piecemealing it. Gathering it as the SLP as things get completed is great. If family turns in that assignment of benefits to you already signed, awesome. Maybe you had conferences the month before, get it signed and have it in a folder. But turning it all in together is highly recommended so that it sticks together. And then the next piece is, so what happens after that? You've done everything, you've turned everything in. Once we receive it in our funding department here at PRC Saltillo, this is just what is going to happen. They're going to verify that insurance is still eligible. Sometimes that happens on the back end where, it's not valid right now, needs to be called, that sort of thing. Reviewing all the documentation to make sure we've got everything, all the contact information, and they've let you know if there is anything missing and how to get that to them. And once they have all of that and did that review to make sure everything is looking good, then it gets submitted to the appropriate funding sources. We do have to submit to all funding sources. So if they have that dual or triple coverage, we do have to submit to all of them. One of them might deny and pass it along to Medicaid, and that's fine, but we do have to submit to all. We often get that asked, well, can't we just submit to Medicaid because we know this one's not going to cover it? No, we have to do, Medicaid is that payer of last resort you might hear. And so we have to get that denial from the other policy first. Common issues that hold up paperwork: missing policyholder signature from that assignment of benefits, or the wrong policyholder signing it, or non-policyholder, I should say. Missing SLP signature or credentials on that evaluation report. Different items requested on the device selection sheet versus the certificate of medical necessity versus the evaluation report. And missing Medicare or Medicaid documentation, that face-to-face note, the prescription, etc. So knowing those and making sure you're watching for those as you complete things helps tremendously. Any correspondence, make sure you're copying your PRC Saltillo consultant when you're talking with funding, just so that in case there is any confusion, everybody's on the same page. They might be able to answer some of those questions a little quicker too. Be patient, but be persistent. Don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions to your consultants and check on the status. If you have specific questions about the missing information, ask us or your consultant and the AAC funding team as they're sending you information as well. And last but not least, we've made it this far.
And the night.
I know. I feel like we should have done it in reverse order than what we're going to present to this, but the long-awaited drum roll, funding source gets back to PRC Saltillo and says there's three options that they might say to us. First one that we put up, which I feel like we should have saved for last, but an approval, which is what we all hope for, right? Definition on there and in your handout. When they say, yep, we approve it, what happens next? Funding will confirm that, yes, we've got the approval. We need to make sure that insurance hasn't changed since we submitted, and that shipping hasn't changed since we submitted. And once we get that at PRC Saltillo, we don't just have a bunch of devices on a shelf. We manufacture them as they are ordered. So we'll get a lead time given of how long it's going to take to manufacture the device and the accessories, with shipping and all of that part shortages across the country and the world. Some of these lead times are getting longer, but they'll give you that information when they let you know about the approval. Another possible outcome is the deferral. This one sounds scary, but it's when they say, we can't make a decision yet. We need more information. And something that they might be asking for is, we need more information about the trial. We need more information about the different places. So maybe you didn't specify enough environments, or different people. They will give you what they're looking for. And when that is received, then you're going to get this information from the funding team, the deferral, the reason, the process for responding to the referral, and usually a timeline. There is a timeline. And if we don't respond in that time, often it's 30 days, then they might switch it right away to a denial. And the final possible outcome is the dreaded denial. And this is when the insurance is saying, nope, we don't authorize payment for this device. The family and or SLP should have received a written communication of this denial, as well as them giving it to us, the PRC Saltillo. It includes the statement, the reason why, the process for responding, and whether or not you can appeal this. If there is an appeal, your consultant can work with you on that, as well as you can request one of our representatives from our legal team to give input on that appeal process as well.
Yeah. Just don't panic if you get a denial, right? Like that's my number one. I always got frantic emails about I got a denial, and there's a process for everything, and just be rational. And I always encourage people just include, resources and further information, and really just convince them, make it so they can't deny you.
Right.
Don't panic.
All right. So the last thing that we wanted to show you is just a quick, and we realize it is almost
we got
8:30.
Can do it.
We can do it. Is our AAC funding website. Let me enlarge it. Sorry. So aacfunding.com. This is where you can create a secure login to use that funding toolkit. And I have a pretend one in here, so no HIPAA. It's my daughter with fake information that I give permission for you to see. But this is where I can go in and make an application and walk through that evaluation report. It walks you through the client information. I can fill all that out and continue writing my funding report. And all those things we talked about on that worksheet are in there. So super slick. I'll log back out. You can upload documents if you have used the toolkit for a specific client right there, or if you wrote your own report and you're uploading information, there's this submit documents where I can submit client information, the AOB, or other completed documents and securely upload them here. Last but not least is the Funding 101 tab. This is where there's all sorts of information about the funding process, templates and samples. Someone asked earlier. Yes, we have specific examples around different diagnoses that you could take a look at, addendum templates, deferral addendum, appeal example letters. And when we were talking about, is an iPad good enough? Sometimes that might be your deferral or denial, and you could rewrite and add information in about that. And then the other portion under Funding 101 is this insurance tips. Use this at the beginning when we're saying, hey, family, can you reach out to your funding source and ask these questions? Here's the information about PRC Saltillo, our NPI, our tax ID, those are things. So.
And there's
Any
a
other
good question that popped into
Yeah.
the window. Is there a general guideline for how long insurance has to answer your submission? And does insurance taking a long time typically mean anything, or is it random? So this is kind of the unfair part in my experience. So I had an insurance that we would check in every month to see what the status of this packet was. And I think at one point, literally, like one of the reviewers said, like, oh yeah, all those just get kind of yeah, Matthew, you can leave. Thank you for joining us. But he would say all of those packets, you know, we just pick them up when we have extra time to review them. So they're really, it's so unfair. You do all this work, and they have no deadlines, no timelines. I can't say that's for all of them, but you know, in this specific case, that was the case with this insurance company. I will say generally though, I think a fair estimate is anywhere from like 3 to 5 weeks for an insurance company to review a packet. And if it's taking longer, you know, upwards of that 4 or 5 weeks, I don't think it means that they're looking more closely at your evaluation. It just means they have more stuff.
Sometimes it's the time of year too. So
Yeah.
if it's the end of the school year, they usually get slammed. And so, or end of the insurance year. So like right now, it might take longer just because they're trying to get things processed before end of the year. So.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It doesn't mean that they're like reading your evaluation like 4 more times before they decide.
Right. And asking your consultant like, hey, you know, typically this time of year, or any feel for how long things are taking, and they can give you. I have times where in Minnesota, it was taking 4 to 6 weeks. Other times it was taking 8 weeks. Sometimes it was taking 3 weeks, like really.
Yeah, no, don't feel bad, Jay. That's the nature of the game. That's a consultant's job.
No, we hear you. We feel the same pain and stress over it too. Like we're checking as much as we can as well to get you information. Thank you, everyone.